Hi, this is Candace Richardson, and we are here with Ms. Erin Jones for the Seattle Medium's Community Spotlight, presented by Brave New World. Erin, how are you?
I'm great.
Thank you for having us in your church home.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Absolutely. We're at the Trinity Church of Pierce County. Tell me what's so special about this place for you.
So this is the reason we're in Washington State. So my husband grew up in Tacoma, but we went to college in different places. We actually got married in South Bend, Indiana, where he was going to graduate school at Notre Dame, and lived there for about 3 years. And then he was in the middle of Bible college in Columbus, Ohio, and got a call from the pastor here, the former pastor, who's the father of the current pastor, who said, hey, we're looking for a youth pastor, and we really want a black youth pastor. So at the time, it was a predominantly white church, and we both looked at each other and said, yeah, this is the time. We were pregnant with our second kid and living in a place that was very far from either of our families. And so it was easy to say yes to come here. And this is now over 21 years that we've been connected to this place.
It's amazing. And part of that story, I know we were talking earlier, was the fact that coming here kind of set the ground for what it is you do today in terms of building bridges, right?
Yeah,
because it was a predominantly white church.
Yes.
And with the influx of you and your family and others coming in, it's now integrated.
It
Do
is.
you want to share any bit about that experience?
So when we got here, the youth ministry we were youth pastors, and the youth ministry was 100% white kids, most of them homeschooled, so most of them had no exposure to people who look like us at all. And now the youth ministry is probably 90% kids of color. So it has really had a huge impact, us being here and then really kind of changing the conversation and exposing people here to difference has really changed how this building functions now. And it's really exciting, and it's given me tons of practice in building bridges and helping people think across difference. And it's the work that I do, not only in the church, but now outside of the church. It's the work I did as an educator in Tacoma, in Spokane, in Federal Way, and now across the nation, talking about crossing cultures and how do we communicate across cultures, how do we disrupt negative narratives about different people groups, and it all started right here in this church.
What you do out in your career, and you bring it home, you bring it to your church home, you bring it to your family home, and then at this point you're even wearing it, right? What you have on right now is an expression of your day in, day out work. Can you explain the attire?
Sure. So for those of you who didn't notice on camera, I have only Nike on. And, I've been an athlete for 42 years now. I'm 47. I started playing sports at 5. And so I've always been involved in athletics and have always liked Nike. But with the whole Colin Kaepernick debacle that happened a couple years ago, I began watching in a different way this athlete who was taking a stand about police. And I just was watching him from a distance and watching how people were responding and watching how the narrative became not about police, but about, these people standing against the flag and being un-American. And that really bothered me. And I think what turned the corner for me was the day we got a call from my husband's father, who is a black man who was raised in Texas. His grandfather was a slave. His father was a sharecropper. He was a sharecropper. He kind of escaped that life by joining the military, served in Vietnam, earned a Purple Heart in Vietnam, fought for his country, did a whole career in the military. And he called us one day about 2 years ago, really teary-eyed. I could hear the emotion in his voice. And he's not an emotional person, but he lives in Tucson, Arizona right now in a very wealthy community. He's a self-made millionaire, worked for Boeing after he left the military, an executive for Boeing. So he has this $1 million home down in Tucson, and he called us to say this. I've been on golf courses for the last weeks, and all of my white golfing buddies are talking about how horrible Colin Kaepernick is, how horrible these people are who are taking a knee. Don't they know how disrespectful that is? And with all this emotion in his voice, he said, didn't I fight for this country so we could choose to kneel or stand? Am I crazy? And I remember hearing that, and it just kind of clicked for me. I'd already been upset by how people were responding to Colin Kaepernick and to others, but to hear my black father-in-law, who devoted a career to fighting for this country, to hear him say, didn't I fight so that we could choose to kneel or stand? It really said something to me. And so when Colin Kaepernick was chosen to be the face of the Just Do It campaign, and I watched a lot of my white colleagues and friends and just people across the country lose their minds. Lose their minds and want to burn their Nike, I said, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm actually going to only wear Nike because I want to make a statement. Number one, who gets to decide what it means to be American? Who gets to decide what it means to be a patriot? I want to challenge that notion. But number two, the Just Do It campaign is about, do you have a crazy enough dream that you're willing to sacrifice everything? And that's what I've been talking with kids about for 25 years. Is your dream crazy enough that you're willing to live or die for it? And so I have only worn Nike. When everyone was giving their Nike away to Goodwill, I went and bought it at Goodwill. And so I, on national stages now, I'm known as the person who wears heels and suits, but I have only worn Nike tennis shoes, Nike skirts. You see I have Nike leggings, Nike skirt, Nike jacket. I very intentionally wear this, and I say that at the beginning of every speech. I talk about why I wear Nike, because I don't want it to be an accident. I don't want people to miss why. And it's not to be antagonistic, it's to invite people into a conversation. And that's why I choose to wear Nike every day. And who knows how long that will last, but for right now, that's all that's coming out of my closet.
You said you're 2 months in, right?
I am, yeah.
What has the response been?
So what's interesting, no one has had a negative response to my face. I'm sure there are people who are upset behind my back, but because of the way that I explain it, I think it would be difficult for someone to come and be antagonistic. There are people who question me and my motives, but more importantly, it has engaged me in a number of conversations about patriotism that may not have happened had I chosen to continue wearing heels in a suit. And I think for kids, it's been this really great conversation starter. I've probably spoken to close to 10,000 students in the last 2 months, and I start every speech talking about this. And so to hear them come up and say, wow, thank you for challenging us to think about it differently. Yeah, we really love the campaign too. And so it's been a great opportunity to engage people in conversation. There's one person in particular that I know who is upset about my choice, but it's a young person who I think has never had to think about race, has never had to think about police or about laws and how they impact different people different ways. And I will continue to wear Nike around this person and push them. And it's not that I think this person or anyone else needs to believe like I do. I'm an educator forever, and I just want people to continue to educate themselves and to continue to question their own motives and the narratives that they continue to repeat over and over. And that's really why I choose to wear Nike.
I want to backtrack a little bit to your background, right? I was watching one of your TEDx talks where you were in the heels and the dress, and you mentioned that you've known rejection all your life from birth.
Yeah.
You were given up for adoption and adopted by 2 Scandinavian American parents,
correct.
Right? In Minnesota.
Yes.
So talk to me a little bit about your experience, and I know that your parents moved to the Netherlands and you were pretty much educated, was it kindergarten through high school?
Yep.
So you were about 4 or 5.
I was 5 years old, 1976.
Do you remember anything about your life in Minnesota before the move?
I do. It's funny because we had our first family reunion this summer. So I've never been to a family reunion from my dad's side ever. We've never had one. But I went this summer, and it was held really near to where my father grew up. And I love to walk. I'm a walker. So I'm walking through town, with my giant afro and my 6-foot-tall frame, and people are staring at me as they drive by in cars. I can see people. I'm watching people as they're just like, who is this lady? But I walked by, there's a tiny little mall in downtown Grand Rapids. And I walked by the mall and suddenly had this memory of myself as either 3, 4, or 5 years old. and walking through that mall and having everyone turn around and stare at me. I remember it very clearly. And what's funny is when we got to dinner that evening, we had dinner with my uncle. He said, do you remember when I walked you through that mall? I said, I do. And I actually went through the mall today. And he said, everyone stared at you. I said, I know. I have that memory. And so I don't have super negative memories of Minnesota. People didn't call us the N-word or anything, but I do remember always being stared at. Every restaurant we ever went to, anytime we were in public, in spaces where we were not known, everyone stared. And there's something about that. When you're a little kid and people are only staring at you, they're not staring at other people, it is really uncomfortable. And you do feel like, what is wrong? Is there something wrong with me? And as a little girl, I didn't think about it being skin color. I just thought somehow, for some reason, we don't belong. And we moved to Europe so early in my life that I got to have a really different experience there. I was not stared at there, which was clear from the beginning of my life, that transition. You know, being in Minnesota, always stared at. Being in the Netherlands, we just got to be the Adamson family, and I never had to think about race or about being different. Even though we were American in an international space, no one ever treated me as different there. And so that contrast of experiences was really clear to me even as a little girl.
And what did your parents, did they address it at all with you growing up? Or was it something that became a non-factor once you did move to Europe?
So it's interesting, you know, people ask, how long did you know you were adopted? Well, you know, it's obvious when your parents are both white. It's obvious that you are not their biological child. But we never talked about skin color until I was in high school, really. When I was a sophomore in high school, my father brought me back to Washington, D.C. for a week. Actually, we were in D.C. for a week and then Harlem, New York for a week with a group called Close Up in D.C. And I'll never forget getting off the plane in Dulles Airport. And every single person was black. Every person. There was not a white person to be seen. And so I'm getting off this KLM flight with all these white people, and we had to walk down onto the tarmac at the time. So it was a big plane, but we got off and had to walk down onto the tarmac. And I'm walking down the stairs, and I look out, and everyone's scurrying everywhere is black. And I'm suddenly aware these people look like me. And it was the first time that I could remember as an older kid being aware of my skin color. And I just began to cry uncontrollably. I can't even explain, but it was like I have found my people. Like there are other people like me. And it was really emotional, and my dad saw me crying and he saw me frozen on the stairs, and he comes running back to the plane, honey, are you okay, are you okay? And I said, Daddy, you never told me there were this many people like me. And I remember my dad, it's the first time I've seen my dad cry, and he cried and he said, honey, I didn't know I'm from northern Minnesota. You know, and we had this moment there that was really powerful. Yeah. And we would take a bus to the hotel where we were staying with a number of other schools. So I can't remember how many other schools were participating with us, but one of the schools was an all-black high school from one of the Carolinas, and I was roomed with two black girls from that high school. And I was so excited to meet other black girls. And instead of rejecting me, which, you know, a lot of black women rejected me when I first came back to the US as a college student, these girls did not reject me. They brought me into their circle. And I remember very clearly they took me to the mall and got me black girl clothes. I don't even know what that meant in 1987, but they adopted me into their group. They taught me how to do the electric slide, and they really made me part of their community. And so when I got back to the Netherlands as a sophomore, my parents realized I needed something more than they had given me. And my parents, who are my heroes, went to every American bookstore in not only in the Netherlands, but in the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany. And they bought me every book on Black history. They bought me every video about Black people. And my mom came home one night and said, I will read every book and I'll watch every video, and I'm sorry I didn't do this for you before. But we began a journey that year that led me to this self-discovery about my history and about culture. I read every book I could get my hands on by James Baldwin and Maya Angelou and Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. And so when I did come back to the United States for college at 18, I knew more about Black history and Black authors than almost every Black person that I ran into. And that was powerful. And for my white parents, to be willing to do that for me and to learn alongside me changed the dynamic even between us. And to this day, they're my greatest champions. And my mom is the first one, when she finds an article about race or racism, she'll send it to me. Hey, did you see this one yet? And you know, my mom is a 5'2" blonde Scandinavian woman, but she is really a champion for social justice and a champion for her Black daughter.
When you grow up in a family that is all white, right? And as you said, you got to the point of being in high school where you realized what the color and the culture, how it had you standing apart. I think it would be interesting to ask you, has your view of white people changed? You know, for a lot of us who do grow up in all Black families and then have to go out into society and deal with white people, you had that at home.
Yeah.
With the current climate, has anything surprised you? If it has any maybe subconscious biases or prejudices or anything that you might have, or just a way of thinking of white culture changed in you at all?
So I think one of the things that I firmly believe is when you have personal relationships with people from different cultures or racial groups or linguistic groups, it causes you to have a broader view of that whole group of people. We tend to have one story about a group of people that we've not had any personal relationship with. So I think what's unique about me is I don't see white people as a whole group. I realize because of my parents and because of their family that each person has their own story and each person has their own prejudices and biases. And so I think I am more able to not paint all white people with one broad brush. And I'm the same with Black people and Latinx people and Native American, because I've had relationships with people, individual people from each of those groups. And so I find where I have prejudice is with groups of people where I haven't had relationships. So all they have is a single story about them. And so I should also say that when I came back to the United States at 18 years old, I went to college in an incredibly racist community. So I got to experience racism from white people in a very profound, in-your-face way. And so with what's happening right now in our country, I'm not surprised because I've been watching it for the last 30 years that I've been in the United States. But I still don't paint all white people with that same broad brush. I think for the most part, there are pockets of white people who just have never been exposed to Black people or Latinx people or anyone who looks different from them. And so I tend to, kind of the way that I live life, I tend to assume people are ignorant before I assume they're racist. And I think because I've been an educator for so long, I see myself always as an educator and always willing to give people the benefit of the doubt. Partly because of experiences I've had in my own family with people who say or have said things that are really racist, realizing, wow, these people just have never been exposed. I'm the only one they've ever met in their life. And so they have all these narratives that they learn from television and they learn from the news. They learn from just not knowing anyone personally. And so I try to give every person the benefit of the doubt and figure out why they believe that. I try not to write people off. It's a hard thing sometimes, but because I also know, and I was sharing this with you earlier, there's not a day that goes by that I'm not aware that I'm a 6-foot-tall Black woman with an afro, right? So I'm always thinking, okay, is this space gonna be an all-white space? How do I need to show up in this space? Can I wear the bright red shoes in this space? I'm aware that there are certain ways people are gonna treat me if I show up this way, as opposed to, okay, I'm gonna do all Black today, or I can wear color in this space. I'm very aware of, if I'm in a wealthier, predominantly white space, how do I show up? And so I'm aware of those things, but I also don't jump in assuming people are gonna treat me improperly or rudely or in a racist way.
But did you come up with that system when you moved back to the United States?
No, I had no idea what to expect. You know, in the Netherlands, I'm not gonna say the Dutch people are not racist at all, because everyone has their own tendencies, and the Dutch, you know, they're part of the colonization of South Africa, so, I mean, we have our own baggage there. But I never experienced racism as a kid. You know, I graduated number 2 in my class. every single teacher that I had told me I could be amazing. I never had a teacher who assumed that I couldn't do anything. I never had a coach who talked me down. I was really blessed to have adults around me who believed that I could move mountains, and they supported me that way. It was a rude awakening when I came to the States at 18, and suddenly it was called the N-word. Suddenly it was told by professors I couldn't, or they didn't believe I could both play basketball and be a great student. And it was the first time and I was not prepared for that. My parents didn't know to prepare me for that. And I don't blame my parents at all. They didn't know to prepare me. But it almost caused me to commit suicide. I was really, at 18, almost 19, I was in a space in my life where I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere, and I didn't feel worthy. And it took getting to the point where I almost committed suicide to realize, oh my gosh, I am not like anyone, and I'm not gonna fit in anyone's box, and I will not let anyone tell me who I can be or not be. And that was an incredible awakening that I had at the end of my freshman year, really after my freshman year, that summer after my freshman year.
What brought you to that moment? Like, was it to the moment of A, wanting to commit suicide, and then B, how you pulled yourself out of that? Was it a string of occurrences, or was there something, a major event that pushed you over that edge?
It was both. I was called the N-word so many times in my first 6 months in the U.S. that I just stopped counting. It was so, and to go from being well respected to that was really tough. And it was before the internet, it was before cell phones, so it wasn't like I could just call my parents and say, hey, people are calling me bad names here, what do I do? I had no friends here in America, so I'm at college really all by myself, completely isolated. And it's not even like being in the US and going to college on the other side of the country. Mm-hmm. I'm across an ocean from everything that I know.
So your parents were still in the Netherlands
They were.
when you came to college?
They were, yeah. They stayed there for 20 more years after I came. So I was really isolated here. I remember when I asked my dean at college if I could major in 3 languages, and she said, are you sure? And I wanted to say to her, I speak 4. Like, I think I can handle this. Mm-hmm. But instead of that, I began to doubt myself. And I played college soccer and basketball. And that freshman year, when basketball season was over and I no longer had community, I just stopped going to class. I didn't know how to be anymore. And I had always been a good student, and I could find myself in that. Like, I knew how to be a good student. I knew how to be a good athlete. And when that athletic piece was gone, I didn't know how to be anymore. And I stopped eating. I stopped going to class. I would just lay in my bed in my dorm for hours at a time in the dark. And one night I prayed this prayer. I prayed, God, would you just take my life? I think I'm a mistake. I think being adopted was a mistake. I think moving to Europe was a mistake. I think believing that I could be a world changer was a mistake. I'm too scared to shoot myself, and I'm too scared to take drugs. Would you just let me not wake up tomorrow? And I woke up the next morning, and I ended up, I felt this weird urge to walk, and I put my tennis shoes on and my shorts, and I walked. And I ended up in a tiny little community outside of Bryn Mawr where the help lived. It's where all the black people lived who worked in the white people's houses. And that particular day, a guy named Dr. Julius Irving was playing basketball. And I didn't know who Dr. J was at the time because I had grown up in Europe. We had the NBA in the late 80s, but it was the day of Michael Jordan and Isaiah Thomas, not Dr. J. So I didn't know I was about to get on a court with one of the greatest NBA superstars ever. And I played basketball with him and his boys that day until the lights came on at 10 o'clock at night. And it was glorious. And it was the first time I felt like I was home. Nobody asked me why I talked different. Nobody asked me where I was from until the game was over. And I was sitting on the sidelines with 4 high school age black boys. And they started asking me questions about where I was from. And they had no idea where the Netherlands was. And I began to ask them questions. Well, where are you from? And they're all from North Philadelphia. All of them had dropped out of high school. And they talked about high schools that didn't care about them, high schools that were falling apart, didn't have enough books. And I remember asking this question, so if you're not going to graduate from high school, what's your dream for your future? And each boy said, I don't have a dream for my future. Why would I dream? I don't plan to live to be 21. And I remember in that moment finding my purpose. I knew in that moment, wow, I was made black and white for a reason. I was made in America, raised in a country that believed in me for a reason. I was made a baller and an academic for a reason, and I will lay my life down for these babies. And I will be the very thing that I told my parents I would never do. I will never be like you. I will never be like you. I knew in that moment I need to be a teacher just like my parents. Yeah. And I knew that, wow, my parents have been world changers all this time, and I just never thought about it that way. And that was the day I devoted my life to education. I started volunteering in a high school, and then I volunteered in an elementary school, and I've been working in schools for the last 27 years because of that experience.
Wow, that's an amazing story.
Yeah.
You know, you pray for, you know, God to take your life because you don't have no reason to live, you feel.
Yeah.
And not only does he wake you up, he gives you Dr. J.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I read, and I was going to ask you when I heard you say that, and I think another interview I read that you had given about the fact that playing basketball with some young African American boys changed the course of your career direction because you were going to be a lawyer.
Right, I was going to be a lawyer.
Right.
Yeah.
And you wanted to work for the UN.
Uh-huh.
You know, and I would assume because you went to school
about a mile away from the World Court, the United Nations World Court. Yeah.
So, I mean, that is a powerful experience to have, to be educated right there. But then you decided to become a teacher. And the one thing that I was reading is you said you went from, you were volunteering in Philadelphia,
yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So you went from volunteering for predominantly African-American students, and then you went to Indiana.
Yes.
And it was predominantly white students that you were working with.
So I started in an all-black, a divided school that was segregated. It was a school they were busing black kids out to a white school in the suburbs. And that was a public school, and I was getting paid $100 a day as a sub. And one day I'm playing basketball with a bunch of athletic directors, and this guy turns to me, his name was Jim, and he says, hey, we have a need for a substitute teacher at our private school in 6th grade English. Would you be interested? And they were willing to pay me an actual contract. And I said, yes, I'll take it. I had no idea what the school was, but it turns out it was an all-white school except for 5 black kids on scholarship. And those kids, I'm still connected to 3 of those kids today. 3 of the black kids, none of the white kids, but I'm still connected. I was the only black teacher ever hired there. I don't think they've ever hired a black teacher there since. Yeah.
Wow. See, I would, you know, and I grew up in a predominantly white school district, I was telling you, here in the Northwest. But I think most people who've never gone to the East Coast or never been to the South or even the Midwest would have assumptions as to what that experience was like. And so when I would read something like predominantly black school to predominantly white school, I would come up with my brain, like you just said, right?
Yeah.
You fill in the story based off of whatever it is you might have seen or heard in the news or on TV. But realizing that you've actually been present in both environments, I wanted to ask you, what is that experience really like? Is there a major difference that you were viewing from one to the other? And what are those, what do those experiences look like? You know, moving away from statistics and test scores and things like that. What was the experience? What were you observing from your time there?
Well, I would say, you know, I've taught in Spokane as well. So I've taught in all white environments that are public schools as well as all black environments that are public. So I've done the private, the public. Most of my career is public schools. But what I would say is zip code and skin color and language still are the greatest factors in determining the kinds of opportunities students get. So if you're in a predominantly white school, you are going to have access to more opportunities. That is still a reality today. And it shows up in all the numbers that you talk about. It shows up in the graduation rates. It shows up in the numbers of students who go to college, who finish college. And it's not about kids' potential. It's about opportunity. Absolutely. It's about who has access to more resources, who has access to advanced placement classes, who has access to counselors who know how to get kids into college. And so I think the greatest lesson I learned in working in the private system and then coming back to public schools, you know, I loved my experience at the private school, but I knew that's not where I was meant to be. I knew those kids were always going to be fine. I knew public school kids needed teachers who really, not only who really loved them, but I knew with my kind of experience, having played basketball all over Western Europe, I played in 14 countries. I speak 4 languages. I knew kids in public school needed to meet someone like me to know that they could do that too. And I knew private school kids were always going to get that. They were going to travel. I became the travel for a lot of my urban students. So when I taught here in East Tacoma, I told stories all the time about going to Paris and going to Switzerland and going to Germany. And what's amazing is how many of my East Side Tacoma kids who'd never traveled before have now traveled, because they saw someone who looked like them and said, oh, if she can do that, I can do that too. And that's why, for me, it was so important to work in urban settings with as diverse populations as I could get around. But I will say, even teaching in Spokane in a predominantly white school, even those poor kids, now they have great access because they have a principal who's really she's fought for access for them. But I watch how communities write off kids. Particular communities get written off all the time, whether it's the Hilltop in Tacoma, or it's the southeast side of Seattle, or it's Hilliard in Spokane. We write off whole swaths of kids based on how much money their parents make or don't make. And that to me is criminal. There's a lesson I learned from a teacher in North Philadelphia that will stay with me forever. She worked in one of the poorest elementary schools in North Philly. 800 of the 1,000 kids in our school had no running water or electricity. America, North Philadelphia. And here's what she said to me one day. She said, Erin, I don't know which of these kids has the cure for cancer, but I teach every one of these babies like they could potentially have the cure for cancer. And this was a school where her kids had no running water or electricity. And so I think we tend to write those kids off. If they're not rich, they're not going to go to college anyway. They can't be smart. Look at their parents. Look what their parents are doing. Nope. I don't buy into that. I think every kid is gifted and talented, and our job is to cull that out of them, to help them find their beauty, and then to empower them to be able to become whatever it is that they want to be in the world. And I think that's been the failure of public school, is certain communities don't get access and other communities do. And then we wonder why the test scores are different. Well, it's all about the opportunity that kids get in and outside of school. And so my crazy dream that I'm willing to sacrifice everything for is so that skin color and zip code and language no longer can predict what kinds of opportunities kids get. And that's what I will fight for until I don't have any breath left.
In 2016, you were raised on a much higher platform because you ran for state superintendent. Was that what everything you just said is? To me, I'm thinking, well, that's the driving force behind you wanting to
Absolutely
move out of a classroom and into policy making.
Absolutely.
Can you explain a little bit more, or dive a little bit more into that decision, to run?
Yeah, I never wanted to be a politician. It's not something that I've ever aspired to. And I would say that even though I ran for office, I didn't run because I wanted to be a politician. I ran because I believed we needed a voice in office that did really understand the needs of various communities. I have taught on the west side of our state and on the east side, and I was really successful as a classroom teacher. I was successful as an administrator, so I thought, what a novel idea to have someone who hasn't just been a politician, but has actually done the work and is seeking to serve. And that's why I ran for office. And I ran because I've worked in all Black communities and all white communities. I've worked in diverse communities. I've worked at every level, from substitute teacher to classroom teacher to instructional coach to administrator to basketball coach. I've done almost every job in public education. I thought, what a novel idea. Somebody who actually understands the breadth of public education, going in and being able to speak with an educated voice about all those different areas, and someone who's going to advocate for the voiceless. Too often, I think, and I understand why now, people who go into politics are people who already have access, who've had opportunity most of their lives, who have a particular perspective that is often limited to white middle class or upper middle class America. And so even with really great intentions, and I would say every politician I've met has really great intentions, but they can't speak for the voiceless people. They can't speak for the immigrant families, the migrant labor families that are in Eastern Washington. I've spent a lot of time with migrant labor families. I speak Spanish, so I can go into communities and listen in their own voices to their needs. I've worked on the Hilltop in Tacoma. Who's representing those voices? right? And so I didn't run because I wanted to be in charge. I ran because I wanted to represent voices. And really what I hoped as a leader was to not just be the voice, but to now set a table for those voices to be at the table, to help me help our legislature and other decision makers make decisions that could positively impact children across our state who don't have a voice right now.
You also ran in an election season. That was probably
The worst ever, if I had known. Yes.
the most contentious it could ever
Yeah.
be. I think we saw it during Obama's administration, the fact that, people could now go use social media
Right.
to express, opinions or viewpoints or to rally people.
Yeah.
And we saw that hit a fever pitch, obviously,
Yes.
with Trump's campaign. And kind of have seen how that
Oh,
how
absolutely.
it's rolling down
Yeah.
to the state and city
Yeah.
legislatures. What was your biggest takeaway? Because I know that, like you just said, intentions don't always matter or always factor in
Right.
in the long run of a campaign.
Right. So, number one, my race became contentious in a way that it probably never has before. Running for state superintendent doesn't often become a contentious race, but because of social media, it did. And when I look back, I think the thing I'm most proud of is in my social media presence, in any media presentations I did, I was very intentional to not badmouth my opponents. And that was really important to me. I wanted to walk away with integrity. I wanted to walk away. It's interesting because my opponent said to me at the very beginning of the campaign, he had been in elected office he'd been involved in politics for 20 years. So I had zero experience in politics, but he'd been involved for a lifetime. And one of the things he said to me is, the greatest lesson I learned from my very first campaign was, you want to win based on your own merits, not by bad-mouthing your opponent. And I took that really seriously. And I do think it was incredible advice. I don't know that he took his own advice, but I took his advice. And I would still stand by that advice. I believe that the greatest ill today of the political process is the way that I see both Democrat and Republican and independent candidates bad-mouthing and bashing their opponents. And I find that disgusting and distasteful. I think we should be voting for the best candidate, and I think candidates should represent themselves in the way they want to be seen. It shouldn't be about who's worse. And so I do believe his advice is really wise, that anyone who's running for office should stand up for what they believe in and what they believe they're good at, instead of discrediting the others. And I think I see way too much of that. In fact, during the midterm elections, I turned off every commercial that I saw where either Democrat or Republican was bashing the other. It disgusted me. And I am really disappointed in both parties and in the rhetoric that we have put out, the narratives that we've put out about the other. We don't need an outside foreign enemy to destroy this country. We're doing it to ourselves. And that, to me, is incredibly disappointing. It makes me very sad. And at the same time, I see the work that I do now is building bridges. And so I try to do whatever I can in whatever spaces I'm in to build bridges, whether it's across racial lines or religious lines. One of my best friends in Lacey is Muslim. She's from Bangladesh. I'm a Christian, but we are incredible friends, and I go to her house all the time, and I eat her food all the time, and so I see what I experienced in my race, the contention there. I see an opportunity now to be something very different and to set a different tone and to challenge my colleagues and friends to show up in a different way.
I think one of the things that I found was interesting that I don't think I paid much attention to until the election happened and, the Women's March, right? All of these women coming together to counteract what they saw was negative messaging, right, out of the presidential campaign. And then watching how that group of individuals or females were then becoming even further sectioned out, right? And the one thing that caught my eye in terms of researching you for this interview was the issue with the Stranger newspaper.
Yeah.
You know, and here you are, someone who is wanting to run for state superintendent because you want to fill in the gaps of where young kids of color especially are faltering. And yet they rescind their endorsement of you over a viewpoint for the LGBTQ community.
Correct.
And what did you learn from that? And was that something that, because I don't think that you would normally or initially take that into account for what it was you were trying to do, but it ended up becoming kind of a stumbling block in your campaign.
I lost because of that.
Yeah,
I mean, that's, we were just talking about that the other day. Well, what's interesting is it became very apparent that there's a purist sense of what it means to be a liberal Democrat, and I was not pure enough in that sense. And, you know, we have what we call an adopted son. He's not officially adopted, but he's been calling me mom for 15 years. So he's gay, and he's been part of our lives for the last 15 years. He's my hairdresser. He's the only white person I will let color my hair. But he's gay, and I remember when they rescinded my endorsement, and he was so angry, and he's like, I want to I want to go talk to all those gay people and tell them, here's how my mom has loved me. And I said, I will not put you out there. I'm not going to allow you to go take the heat on my behalf. If you were to ask any of the students that I had in my classroom who were gay, how did Miss Jones treat us? When I taught in Spokane, which is a super conservative community, I only taught one class. I basically taught teachers when I was in Spokane, but I had one class. So I didn't have a ton of students, but every lunch period, who was in my classroom? I had the conservative Muslim with hijab, the one girl in our whole school that wore hijab. I had the conservative Christian from the Ukraine. I had the one gay Republican in our school, came and had lunch with me every day. I had the two biracial kids who were in special education. I had another lesbian student on the basketball team who'd come hang out with me at lunch. And what I find so interesting about the way the Stranger painted me is they painted me as this anti-LGBTQ plus person, which is not who I am. But the way that they wanted me to tell my story or to talk about being LGBTQ was not in the way that they wanted me to talk about it. And I think it's kind of ironic that we're here in my church, because I think also faith became a huge part of it. So I had to do an interview after my endorsement was rescinded by the Stranger. There were several other liberal organizations that wanted to rescind my endorsement. And so they required me to do extra interviews after the Stranger rescindment. And one of the women specifically said, are you willing to deny your faith? And here's why I think that's really important in Washington State. We're the most anti-church state in the country. The east side of our state is there's a lot of people of faith. But on the west side, and particularly in Seattle, it is really kind of this anti-God community. It's very kind of anti-church. And I think because of that, it gets back to something you said earlier, when we paint whole swaths of people with one brush. I think the Christian church has been painted with one brush. We're all like Jerry Falwell, right? We all have these ideas about pro-life and about being gay or being transgender. The church is anti all of that. Well, that's not who I am. I am not Jerry Falwell. And in fact, I have lots of relationship with transgender people who I would consider to be friends of mine. But I think I was painted with this broad brush. And I told them, I will not denounce my faith. And I apologize for those people who say they're of the same faith as me, who are anti-transgender, who are anti-gay. But that's not who I am. And I think what I learned is that we don't do nuance well in the political arena either. You have to be either black or white. There's no gray in the middle, and I live in the gray. I am biracial, right? I physically embody the middle. And so, it's something I've considered when people ask if I'd ever run again. I don't know that I would, because I don't know that the political arena allows for the middle. I think the political arena, especially now, is really driven either far right or far left. And I run right down the middle. And I believe that I'm the kind of person that I do want to bring all those people into a space. I want to bring Muslim and Christian and gay and straight and transgender all in one space. And I want to create a space for all of them. And I don't know that right now as a country we're ready for that. And I don't know that King County is really ready for that. But it's why I do the work I do now, and it's why I like to be out of the political spotlight, because I can do that work in a way that is not judged in the same way that the stranger was judging me. And I get, they're a particular form of media, and they are all about the flash and the pizzazz and the hot story. And so I understand the dynamic that they were running with. But it still pains me that because I couldn't support their cause in a particular way, now my whole story is written off. And all the good work that I have done around supporting kids who are vulnerable and marginalized, all of that has been written off. I'll never forget, probably one of the most powerful responses to that article was by a lesbian woman that I taught with we've known each other for over 20 years. And I remember she responded to the story and said, "Do you know what's heartbreaking?" She said, "As a lesbian woman, Erin is one of the people who's fought for Black and brown children for her whole career, and you're gonna write her off and force her to not be able to do that work because she's not pure enough on that piece of what you care about." And she said, that's what's heartbreaking. And I think that was the greatest testimony for me, to hear from a friend who knows me well. But again, it's about relationship. I think when people don't have relationship, they see one side of you. They see a perspective about you, and it's never the whole story. And that's the other thing I know about media too, that we all have a perspective. I don't think there's any media that's not biased in some way, because we as human beings are writing stories, and we write from our own perspective. And so I don't hold it against the author who she wrote 5 hit pieces against me. I don't hold any ill will towards her at all. I know she was doing her job, and she did her job really well. And I just think it was unfortunate, because I think a story was told about me that was not complete. And but at the same time, it drove me into the LGBTQ plus community and into opportunities to connect, because I went out of my way after that point to really start asking some questions and meeting with people, and it caused me to learn in a way that I never may have learned about that community and supporting the community.
What sticks out in your mind from that experience when you say that you've learned in a way that you had never learned before? Was there any kind of moment or event of awakening or conversations that you had that said, I didn't see something that way before and I see it now?
But it's about relationship. I realized I had lots of relationship with lesbian and gay students. I didn't have any relationship with the transgender person at that point. And so to think about how might I have talked about or thought about issues for transgender students differently had I had personal relationship. And so it drove me into being intentional about building some relationship. I met with some students at my husband's school and just asked, wow, what would you want an educator to know about you and about your experience, and how could we better support you in schools? And I think it just reinforced the message that I've always believed, that personal relationship is where true change happens, and it's where changes of heart happen. And that's where, for me, it was an opportunity to learn and grow.
So after your race, you decided not to go back into teaching, but to become a private consultant, right? Do you feel more freedom? First of all, why don't you explain, what do you do? What does consultant mean? In the work that you do, and do you feel that it's freed you to dive deeper into the issues you care about? So
what's really exciting, when I ran for office, I didn't run because I wanted to be in charge. I ran because I wanted to be a champion for kids. And I remember, first of all, my election was the closest election in our state that year. So I lost by less than 1%. And what that meant is they were still counting ballots 3 weeks after the election. So I didn't actually know that I had for sure lost until the end of November. So I'm waiting and waiting and waiting. And the day that I conceded my race, I reached out to all of my friends on Facebook who were teachers, and I said, You guys, I got into this not to be in charge, but to be a champion for kids. Anyone have a classroom that I could come talk in? And literally that next day I was in a classroom talking. And then I got invited to another classroom and another classroom. And I remember in December, it was the end of December, and my husband looked at me and said, honey, you've been in so many classrooms now. I think you need to start your own LLC because you're going to make enough money that we need to pay taxes in a different way. If you can make a certain amount of money, I think you should just do this. Do you think you can make that much money? And I said, I think I can. I'm getting requests every day to come do training with people around culturally responsive practice. I had been invited, I think that year already by December, to do 10 or 15 Martin Luther King assemblies. So I just stepped out on faith and said, I'm going to try this for a year and see what happens. And I made as much in my first year as a consultant doing work with school districts, King County, colleges, churches. I made as much as I did as an administrator. And it wasn't, I didn't go out looking for any. I don't even have a website today. Everything is word of mouth. And so I do work around equity and culturally responsive practice. Probably about 50% of my time is doing training, and then 50% of my time is doing speaking, either at conferences or doing assemblies. So since I lost my election in 2016, I've spoken to over 200,000 kids in schools and probably close to 50,000 adults.
And what does the training look like? Is it all about, we were talking before we started rolling with the cameras, but getting people who are in roles as educators, dealing with kids of color or kids who might be marginalized, having them see them in different ways, right? Not that one story,
right,
but developing one-on-one connections with them about what that student might need. Is that the basis of most of your training, or is there more to it than that?
So I do work with school systems, I do work with nonprofit organizations, government entities, and all of it is about, number one, understanding what does equity even mean? Because I think people often think equity and equal are the same. And they're not at all the same. Equal is giving everyone the same thing, expecting the same results. Equity is recognizing that everyone comes into the system with different needs and different barriers. And it's about taking away barriers for certain groups of people and providing additional supports wherever it's necessary. And so I start out by unpacking some terminology, because I think we tend to be really irresponsible about terminology, and we throw out words like race, like ethnicity, like culture, as if everyone knows what they mean, and they just don't. And so it's unpacking those terms. Like race is a created term, and it's really about how people read you and how they then tell your story based on what they assume when they read you. It's so people see me and they don't see biracial women raised by white people.
Right.
They see black women, right? And so they read me a certain way and they tell my story. And it's really helping people understand that that is a created thing, and we have to unpack those stories. Because if you're telling a story about me, you're not telling the right one, because my story doesn't represent, or my face and my hair doesn't represent the fullness of my story, just like your presentation, your physics doesn't tell us your story. So it's really encouraging teachers to recognize that we all, because we have lived in this country long enough, have stories that we tell about whole groups of people. Ethnicity is how we choose to identify ourselves. So we are completely in control of that. And then culture is, what are our values and norms? And that's not race-based, right? But I think a lot of white people especially think culture is race. And I really unpack those terms to help people see, no, we all have culture, and culture is really driven by where do you live. It's driven by who shares space with you, what are the values that you build together, and unpacking those stories and then disrupting narratives and getting teachers or government officials to unpack their own stories. Because one of the things I learned from moving to the United States later in life is most Americans don't unpack their own stories, and so they ooze their culture and they assume that everyone around them has the same culture, but because they've never unpacked their own cultures, they project their culture as the right way. And when you don't show up in their space in the right way, you're bad, you're less than. And this is what's happening for students in schools. If you show up as a student and your culture is different from your teacher, you're often disciplined in different ways than other students. Same with the police force, right? If you don't show up in a certain way, you could be disciplined and go to jail in higher numbers because you don't show up in the same way. And so helping people who are in charge, whether that's educators or police officers or government officials, unpack their own stories, understand how they got to where they are, what's the why behind how you got here, really helps them then understand and interact differently with people who are different. So kind of unpacking implicit bias and how did you come to believe this way about Latinx folks or about Black folks or about men? If you can unpack that first and really begin to see, oh, wow, that's why I have this story. I need to replace that story with a different story. That's really the work that I get to do with people.
That's awesome. That reminds me of, part of what you said reminded me of when I was in college, I took French. And I remember asking my teacher when we were going through identifying how to say other cultures, right?
Yeah,
or other ethnicities. I was like, well, how do you say African American?
Yeah.
I know how to say Afrikaan, you know?
Right.
How do you say African American? And they said, there's no word for that in French.
Nope.
You're American.
Yeah.
You would identify yourself as an American.
Yeah.
And that was a light bulb moment for me because we don't realize how often as African Americans we also consider ourselves as other or separate from just the country we live in. Like we are our own culture within this overall American culture, right? Whereas anyone in other cultures would say, no, you're
we just see you all as American.
Yeah.
And that's what's interesting for me growing up in Europe. I was just seen as American, not as Black American or African American. And then I got here and it was suddenly something very different and we were divided. You know, I do this activity with teachers where I have them get together in groups based on shirt color and then shoe color and then eye color and hair color. And really it's this expression of how often in this country we divide ourselves, right? Either people divide us or we divide ourselves, and how dangerous that is, and how we are really intersectional. So we really have much more in common, but because of our love for boxes, you know, check this box for gender, check this box for sexual orientation, check this box for color, we've really created these separate little tribes in this country. And if we can't figure out how to come together, I worry that we're ripe for kind of a civil war. And I think that is a very dangerous thing. And I love being a Black woman. I do. I love my skin color. I love my hair. And at the same time, I'm American. And so how do we find that common ground for all of us and acknowledge in many ways, you know, where this country has failed us as a people, but also how do we become part of the solution of creating a United States of America that's good for all of us? And that's where I push back against Make America Great Again. It's never been great for everyone. And I want to stay here. I didn't go home to the Netherlands because I want to make it great for every single person. And it means unpacking our own story as a country, understanding our own story. How did we come up with the laws that we have, with the public institutions that we have? Where have we failed certain groups of people? How do we unpack that? And then maybe begin again. Rewrite laws, rewrite policy to make sure that every person has the greatest opportunity for success possible.
You sure you're done with politics?
I'm not sure. You know, I'll never say never. And at the same time, as knowing how ugly it is, I don't know that I would willingly put myself back in that space again. And at the same time, who else is going to do it? You know, so I haven't said no. If I run again, I will run for state superintendent again, and I have another year to make that decision. So I love what I get to do now, and I feel like I have such great influence right now, and I can be myself fully, and I love that. And so right now, I don't feel like it's something that I want to pursue, but I stay involved. I work with now the National Organization for Women. I still continue to help support women who are running for office. And so I'm not out of it. I'm the chair of the African American Caucus for the Democratic Party. So I've kept my foot in the door. But in terms of running for office again, it's not something that's on my bucket list. I just want to make a difference. And I feel like right now I'm making the biggest difference that I can make from where I am.
So normally I would say, is there anything that I haven't asked you that you want to add, that you want people to know?
Yeah. You know, one of the things we haven't talked about, you know, I'm an athlete. I stopped playing basketball 2 years ago when I ran for office because I knew if I sprained an ankle, trying to be on the road with a sprained ankle was not going to be fun. So I stopped playing 2 years ago, but I was playing 5 days a week at 45 years old. And now I run. And I run in half marathons, I run 10Ks. And I tell people it's as intentional as my attire is right now. I try to run 3 to 5 miles a day, not because I love running, but number one, because I believe in keeping my body fit. I need a lot of energy to do the work that I do, so I need to stay. But more importantly, I run 3 to 5 miles a day because it's my physical practice of pushing through discomfort. I think where we are as a nation is going to require us to push through discomfort. And I feel like for the last 2 years, it has been a discipline for me to physically push through discomfort 5 or 6 days a week, to train my body in that way, because I am having conversations with pretty powerful people that are really uncomfortable. And if I don't practice that physical discipline, I think it's easy to stop in the middle of uncomfortable conversations and to just say, you know what, this is too much. You know, in the first mile of when I'm jogging, I feel like, why am I doing this? This doesn't feel good, it's not fun. I get to the second mile and I feel like I'm gonna die. Like, why did I get out here today? This hurts, I'm tired. And I get to the end of that second mile and I feel like if I can get to the beginning of the third, I could run 10 miles without stopping. And it's that physical practice every day for me that is, it's also mental. And I feel like we each need to have that thing that we're pushing through to really train our body, both physically and mentally, because this is a season where we can't afford to give up. We can't afford to give up on this country. And so for me, yeah, the physical attire says something about me, but that physical discipline every day, I try to do it 6 days a week, of running 3 to 5 miles is really intentional. And you know, at almost 50 years old, it's important for me to stay fit and to stay on top of my game. And I think the only way I can do that is to push myself beyond where I think I can go.
And that's the message I think a lot of our people need,
Yeah.
especially because the health, you know, nobody understands, and I think until you've gotten to a certain point of health, right? How much your physical health affects
everything
your mental
else,
health, your emotional health.
Yeah.
And you just said it best, getting through where the stage that we're at now
Yes.
requires you to have all your faculties as much as possible. Right? Thank you, Erin.
Thank you.
You've been watching the Community Spotlight with Erin Jones. I'm Candace Richardson. This is for the Seattle Medium, presented by Brave New World.